Hi, I'm Clara. This is the first time I'm presenting at a conference in person in a very long time, so I'm very excited about that. And today what I'm presenting is a zine that I created as the final paper for a class on post-colonial and decolonial feminisms. It was a grad seminar. And I'm going to go through some of the major themes that I addressed in the zine. The zine is named after a poem by Brazilian poet Carlos Drummond de Andrade, and I'm going to talk about it a little later in this presentation. So reading through the texts that were assigned as a part of our grad seminar, I noticed there was a big difference between two groups of decolonial authors that we read. The first one that included Aníbal Quijano, Walter Mignolo, Catherine Walsh, and Boaventura de Souza Santos based their colonial projects on the idea of alternative epistemologies and ontologies. Regardless of these authors' particular conceptualizations, they coincided in the idea that the praxis of decolonization means changing the terms of the conversation, decolonizing knowledge, expanding sociologies, and finding the cracks within the colonial matrix of power. And I felt deeply unsettled by these propositions as they seem to evade the material conditions of colonization that are in dialectical relations with the colonial matrix of power, and that determine the material realities in which colonial or alternative forms of knowledge exist. And then a second group of authors that we read that includes Leanne Beresimowski-Simpson and Linda Tuhiwai-Smith talked about decolonization as intrinsically dependent upon the end of land and body disposition of indigenous peoples. And one of the first themes then that I wanted to address with the zine was the stark difference between these two projects of decolonization by putting them together in conversation. And I don't necessarily think that these two different projects of what decolonization means are mutually exclusive. But I am interested in thinking about what this first group, meaning Quijano, Mignolo, Walsh, and Santos, what are they overlooking and what do they miss by not addressing the material conditions of colonization and decolonization? And what happens when we look at these two groups of authors together? So I put all of these quotes together because they're talking about very different things. So for example, the quote, I did this, yes. This quote here talks about how decoloniality is redefined and is now focused on epistemology and on knowledge rather than the state, while we have Leanne Beresimowski-Simpson talking about land and body dispossession and how fixing the social ills without addressing that doesn't stop the system that causes harm. And we also have her here somewhere in this thing this one here, talking about things enacted by the state, such as the Indian Act, residential day schools, the residential schools and day schools, and other things that have happened to indigenous peoples that have prevented them from developing their own forms of knowledge and they are still happening today. And then in order to bridge this gap between these historically and geographically specific ways of knowing and the material conditions that support them, I turn to the concept of modernization. In Quijano, Mignolo, Walsh, and Santos, and again, I'm not considering their individual perspectives, the concept of modernity comes up as, again, an epistemological and ontological project. Meanwhile, the concept of modernization from a Marxian perspective refers to ongoing processes and a tautological process that unfolds into itself and that includes ways of knowing and being, as well as the material conditions engendered by accumulation of capital. So through this idea of modernization, I address this disconnect between the conceptualization of colonization or the colonial matrix of power in Quijano and those other authors, and the related material conditions, including but not limited to land and body dispossession. And I bring this critique to the zine in various ways. One is what I call the This is Modernization series, which is some images similar, which is these images are a part of, in which we see images of precarious work here and here too. Since the project of colonization and modernization includes forcing people to reproduce themselves through labor for capital, and a lot of the times extremely precarious labor, in particular for people of color and immigrants and other people undergoing other forms of oppression. And this forced, this violent imposition of labor was a fundamental component of colonization projects on the past, and is still a fundamental component of modernization as a social process. And modernization also appears in this big poster, which is all scenes of protests. We have here Black Lives Matter in the US, protests for reproductive justice in Argentina, protests for indigenous land recognition in Brazil, and for press freedom in Hong Kong. And here is protests in Bolivia for labor justice. And I use these images to address the fact that modernization puts us in a position to have to fight for the bare minimum. And having to struggle for these things represents modernization as well. Another big way in which I address modernization is through the idea of through mining as an economical activity, but more than that. And that's a big underlying theme of this zine. In page 3 here, these images include the labor of mining and landscapes destroyed by mining. And in the background of these pages here is an aerial image of the breakdown of a tailings dam in Mariana in Brazil. And these were all black. This is an aerial, this is the river, this is where the dam was. And these were all black and indigenous communities that we see here covered in toxic waste. So that refers back to what Leanne Simpson was saying, where these knowledges cannot exist if we don't have the material conditions for them, if we don't have the land, what Leanne Simpson calls landless pedagogy. And the poet Carlos Drummond de Andrade, whose poem titles the zine, is from this same region where this tragedy, this environmental crime happened in Brazil. And he saw his childhood landscapes being destroyed by mining. And given this experience, mining is also a recurring theme in his work, and one that is frequently in his poetry tangled with modernization. In my interpretation, the idea of machine of the world in Drummond's poetry references these processes of modernization or even of capital accumulation. And this poem also brings up the idea of the machine of the world here. The actual machine of the world poem is 5 pages long. That's why it's not actually in the zine. I thought about reading it today, but it took 10 minutes just to read the whole thing. So that's why I'm not doing it, but I'm happy to share it with anybody who's interested. And the machine of the world, the poem, is in itself a reference to a Portuguese epic poem called the Lusíads, published by Luís Vaz de Camões in 1572. And this poem narrates the discovery of the maritime route from Europe to India and celebrates colonizers that participated in these voyages. And in this poem, in this epic poem, the navigators are offered by sirens to see the machine of the world, which is represented here in this background image. And that in that poem, the machine of the world is a vision of the world's inner working secrets, and which is the cosmogony of the time. So here you have Earth, air, fire, moon, and the planets, and a representation of what they believe the universe to be like. And then Drummond reclaims this image in a 1951 poem called The Machine of the World that describes a man who's walking down a dirt road and suddenly the sky opens up and offers him to see the machine of the world. And the metaphors used in that poem refer back to mining, refer back to modernization, to industrialization, and symbols that are very much connected with the inner workings of the contemporary world. But then, in Drummond's poem, the man refuses to see the machine of the world and just continues to walk down the dirt road that he was in. So naming the zine after both of these poems puts the zine into this conversation. What is the machine of the world? Is it the colonial matrix of power? Is modernization as a material, epistemological, and ontological project? And in that sense, could the machine of the world actually be the same in Delusiad's, Drummond's poem, and the zine? And these are the questions that together tie all of the elements of the zine. And I just wanted to go through this last section where I'm also thinking with the first group of authors that are thinking about decolonial studies within the university, and I'm asking if the university can really be decolonized. Especially given that in Mignola and Walsh's book that we read for this seminar, they're talking about finding the cracks within academia and not straight up dismantling the academic industrial complex. So here I bring images of, sorry, yeah. As the statue of George Washington at University of Washington in Seattle. So what is the meaning of doing decolonial studies when we're still upholding these images? And what is the meaning of doing decolonial studies within this kind of economic system of citations and publishing and impact factors and all of those things? And then I end the zine with a quote from abolitionist geographer Ruthie Gilmore. Abolition requires that we change one thing, everything. Thank you.